And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me right here. Brighteon TV, uncensored mini ice age conversations. They're moving us from insects to seaweed. Now, why would they do that? Because they want to farm the oceans and capture the carbon credits. In addition, eminent domain being used against our farmers for non-public utilities. They want to run CO2 sequestration pipelines through farmlands for private companies. This gets into a whole box of worms here because this is going to be a multi-trillion-dollar industry. The 2050 goals say that any carbon can no longer be offset by planting trees. It has to be captured underground storage. So the carbon capture underground storage is the new rage, but they need sets of pipelines, compression stations, which will again be trillions of dollars to build out the infrastructure. But the farmers are in the way. Hey, thank you for joining me. David Dubine, Mini Ice Age Conversations, right here, Brighteon TV, uncensored. Now, as we look across the world, what is happening with the news feed? Well, we switched months. We're deep into July right now, and the world is the hottest it's ever been. It's on fire, the blowtorch, but you need that to continue to push the zero carbon emissions, the net zero, which a lot of people, including myself, really hadn't dug out into the 2050 information. You know, everything in 2030 is so close in. World Economic Forum, talking about switching to insects, this sort of thing. Now that's what's in front of you, but what's behind back there, not a lot of people are seeing, including myself, until I started to see this eminent domain battle from our farmers against private companies wanting to run pipelines through their very valuable farmlands. And they only wanted to pay them for 3 years of lost production on their crops. And then after that, it's a freebie for the company. There's no operating costs after that. But for this charade to work, you have to believe that we are changing the climate. Now, today's will make you baffle and shake your head at the end of this. Even if we just look into Australia, they're facing record cold temperatures in northern Australia up near Indonesia. This was to be expected with the eruption and the water vapor in the atmosphere after the Hunga Tonga eruption in the beginning of 2022. When I was starting to manifest across equatorial bands, say from 0 to 15 north and south, a lot more drag there. It's a lot heavier air mixed in with a lot more water vapor, so things are slowing down. That's why they're seeing all these record floods across the equatorial bands as we speak. So the darker purple and green, did that make the world news of the hottest ever? No, because it's trending toward cooler temperatures. You know, there's these anomalies happening everywhere. And if we were to look at July 19th, which was supposedly at the end of those 7 days of the most record heat ever recorded ever, you know, where you see blue, those are below normal temperatures. And it even shows you 2 degrees Fahrenheit below the average over 30 years, anywhere it's blue. So, you know, you can find these maps, but just generally, news agency is going to run with the hottest ever, and then if they have to retract, they'll retract like, you know, months later. But the whole thing is to plant the seeds continuously of the most absurd headlines of it's the warmest years ever, and we're the cause of it. See, if you ever realize, and me and the whole world wake up to that it's a natural cycle, this sham, this grift stops, and it never, ever comes back. Ever. That's what's so terrifying for those trying to set up this system of transference of wealth. This is about transferring all wealth in the world into the hands of a few and bring back feudalism where you won't be able to stay on the land. Some sort of capture storage or some sort of environmental policy will restrict you from being on that land as long as you believe it's man-made and not a cycle. See, this is the thing. One of the secrets to reducing the appearance of aging is to consider your collagen levels. When your collagen levels decline, as they naturally do with age, your skin begins to show visible signs of aging, like those fine lines and wrinkles. That's because collagen is essential for maintaining skin elasticity and hydration, and for bringing a youthful glow to the face. That's why I highly recommend including collagen into your daily regimen. Go to healthwithadapt2030.com or click on that link in the description box below. That's healthwithadapt2030.com. And now on with the video. And you know, it's the hottest time of the year because it's summer in the northern hemisphere. Hey, note to self, it's summer, it's always hot. But joking aside, our bees, they really need our help right now. They're coming into what's called the dearth, which means there's not going to be a lot of wildflowers because it's coming sort of after the first blooms. There's going to be some, fall flowers coming out like goldenrod, etc. But in general, this is the time of the year the bees need our help the most. So using marbles there with a bowl full of water with marbles so they can land on without drowning, and then they can put their proboscis in there and drink the water. And if you have any sugar cubes that you could put next to that, would also be very helpful for them to get some food that they cannot get on their own. So with that being said, summer is always hot, always has been. That's why they call it summer. Now there's many parts of this Rubik's Cube. So we're going to line them up in order here, and you're going to see how they're going to loop back on themselves. So Tony Heller doing a lot of different work of pulling a huge amount of data back from 1912, 1922, 1930, showing that temperatures were warmer during the Dust Bowl era or equivalent to what we have now. So there's nothing like this just popped out of nowhere. It's a repeating cycle. So look at this. During the Little Ice Age, which was approximately 1650 to 1720, that's 70 years there. Maunder minimum is the proper scientific name for it. There were 100 million bison just in the Great Plains of the US. That is not counting the plethora of animals across the planet emitting methane. Just 100 million bison. In the entire world, so they say, with all animal husbandry, including cattle, there's only about 1 billion animals across the entire planet currently. So you got to think of that. All that methane coming out of those animals, and they were in one of the coldest periods that had been seen in the last 8,000 years. So here it is for you. The blue drops off from the medieval warm period, which the climate gate papers were about, dropping that temperature in the past to make it appear that it was a continuous warming. Well, I'll agree. We were coming out of a mini ice age. So what would you expect if the planet is naturally warming out of a mini ice age, that things would continue to get warmer until they plateaued, and then the next cycle of cooling would begin once again. But these are the Central English temperatures here, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere. Not as much data down there for some reason from the Little Ice Age, but temperature dropout, but we still had that kind of methane emissions from the amount of cattle and bison that were around naturally, plus all the other animals around the world. How much more plant life was there and animal life was there in 1650 compared to now? So this only goes back 1,000 years prior into time. So I'll jump you back a little further. So if we come back past the Viking Age, which was the collapse of Greenland, by the way, it was called Greenland because, well, there were green pastures there. We can come back to the Greek, and then also the ancient Egyptians, where we see their warming periods were warmer than ours today. So this comes off the Greenland Ice Core Survey Project, or the Greenland Ice Survey Project. And again, this was the gold standard. And I spoke about this one video before, and I had a bunch of questions, like how do they even know what they're looking for down there? So I'll show you here is one of the ice cores. They come out of different tubes, and then what you'll see, those cylindrical silver tubes, is where they store that in deep freeze storage. So after they pull the cores out, they put them in those tubes. And as you can see, once they put light underneath it, you can see the different layerings, and each one of those is like a tree ring. It's a different year of deposition. So you can see how much thicker it is or how much thinner it is, and that would be the amount of snowfall that fell or didn't fall. The amount of runoff before the next layer had accompanied and then deposited on top. Now, once you get down to the chemical analysis, you can actually see the bubbles of CO2 incorporated in that. But visually, you can already see where the years are. So they went back, far in time here, somewhere around 15,000 years and is the established, but they went back even to 40,000 years at that point to show us these temperatures are varying at all times. Now, so we keep hearing this, the warmest ever. Okay, but how do you explain under the Mendenhall Glacier in Alaska that there's forests that had to grow before that? What's first, the chicken or the egg? Did the glacier cause the trees to grow? It meant that area in Alaska had massive forest, and then it was covered by glaciers. See, it's the inverse of what we're being told. And it's just there's a myriad of these types of bits of information out there that make you question, like, how can they get away with it? People just don't have time to do research. And what we saw through the last 3 years is just they almost accept authority as, that's it. I don't even need to do any research. Somebody else told me it was, so it is. Here's something also that's getting caught in the cogs of the disruption here. A lot of facts are coming out about this green agenda now. Now, if we go over just into Scotland here, since the year 2000, they've cut down 15.7 million trees to make way for windmills. Now, this is going to, roll away and amplify, because between 2025 and 2035, they're expected to cut down another 20 million trees. 20 more million trees are going to disappear out of Scotland. Now, at that current rate from 2000, that was 1,700 trees per day disappeared. Now, see, that's the solution for carbon capture, is planting more trees. There's real simple things that can help us. And imagine if it was fruit and nut trees, things that would provide food for us for free. So imagine every reforestation project was based around food production for that local area, local latitude, local grow zone, 7A, 7B, wherever you are. We're in 7A down here, Tennessee. But the amount of free food that could be distributed across the planet during these reforestation projects. And it is astonishing that they can get this much damage in a forest and still with a straight face say that you're responsible for the changes that we're seeing. And another one that tags right along with these 100 million bison that were around during the Little Ice Age. This is off the World Economic Forum. Again, they're the pushers, the leaders of trying to get the conversion from one system to another by this sort of underhanded way with your compliance, because not the full picture is given. So this study is now moving toward cattle feed into seaweed for cattle feed versus what we know as grains today. So they want to start to give them a different type of seaweed, although the cattle don't like it. They even say straight up, it takes them about 2 weeks to get adjusted to the taste, which means they starve them until they have nothing else to eat. And that's the only choice they have. And then they eat it. It's like you with your least favorite food. If I put you in a room and starve you, eventually you'll eat that food. Well, they're doing the same thing with the cattle. And then they get them on a program for about 30 days of just almost all seaweed until they just, I guess, get used to it. And then they start to add adjuvant and other feed products back into their food supply. And this is all in some sort of wild scheme to reduce methane emissions. And I said, okay, I'll dig into this a little bit further. It's this type of red seaweed, asparago. You can farm this. There's farms around the world that are working with this type of seaweed. Now, another thing that ties into this is carbon sequestration, which now they want to do in the oceans by growing seaweed and then getting the allotted CO2 credits per ton by growing this seaweed, which will then be mandated by the government to feed the cattle. So you see, to get into this feedback loop of government mandates, pushing into the next thing that's going to make more corporations more money by the carbon credits. But you can see step by step, okay, cows are bad. We need to reduce methane. You want to eat, they got to eat seaweed. Okay, I believe in that. Oh, wait, by the way, all the corporations who grow the seaweed get $30 to $85 per ton of CO2 sequestered, and we'll do the math and we'll give them cash. By the way, that's what that global tax that you're going to be paying for is to pay all these companies their CO2 sequestration and carbon credit tax allotments and refunds. That's coming from you. That's not coming from the government. That's why all this talk about CO2 taxes is out there. They're not going to pay it. Governments aren't going to pay it. You, the serf, are going to pay it. So this is supposed to reduce methane emissions and feed costs without affecting the meat quality. But I, am still at a loss to find cows that naturally eat seaweed. They might eat some algae in ponds. I get it. There's an enormous amount of ponds and lakes where cattle are close to. But for them to just start nibbling on seaweed, that's a divergence, just like pushing insects into your diet. Doesn't seem to really work. But since there's such massive pushback on the insects, right? They tried to sell us the insect thing here for a minute, but there was so much pushback and so much ick a factor associated with that. That look how the pendulum is swinging. You're now a cattle. They want you to eat seaweed. This comes off The Guardian here. Scientists believe mass production of a species called ulva which if you've ever had sushi or been to Japanese restaurants, that's that type. There's a lot of edible seaweeds for humans. Absolutely there are. But they want to harvest it also as a stable crop. And this will be necessary to keep Europe from food shortages. So just like you, the cattle, you're going to have a substitute food source put into your daily intake. Now, for me, that's much more appetizing, because even at the very last sentence, it says, oh, it's a green seaweed. It's very mild, slightly salty flavor with a nutty aftertaste. Well, that's way better than a cricket, in my opinion, but that's just me. Would you switch over to seaweed? You know, a lot of people are saying, I'm not going to be a vegetarian, I'm not going to change the diet. Well, you're going to be forced to, and they even say it's going to prevent European food shortages. So what do they know about the stoppage of foods? Oh, wait, Ukraine just stopped the grain corridor. Now, just an FYI, see, I had heard it from, I'd gone out on other news. I went up to Al Jazeera, I went up to RT, and I was looking over at South China Morning Post, and I went way outside US news. And what they were saying was Russians had closed down the Black Sea for any types of grain vessels going in and out of Odessa port. But the Americans were going to take 2 military destroyers or whatever kind of escort ships with that and try to run the blockade with a grain carrier with military escort and try to escalate and have some sea collision or make the Russians fire on the American ships or the grain ship. So the Russians went in and completely blew Odessa, the port facilities, to smithereens where there's 0% chance that you could even load anything. So now if anybody tries to, force a carrier, a grain carrier in there with military escort, everybody know it's fictitious because you can't load anything there anymore. And now there's so much pushback from the Eastern European countries from the dumping of Ukraine crops. They're like, you got to keep it in the border. So we're going to lose a significant amount of Ukrainian production outbound to some of these lesser developed nations that rely on that. But here we go, the shift in the diet. So if we're looking at land-based mitigation opportunities, and this is by 2050, the way that they think they're going to cut CO2 emissions, not stopping commerce, but cutting it in different ways within this sphere of the human domain. I put it in red there, shifting diets, almost 8%. That's nearly 10% of the entire emissions of the planet from the human is going to be curtailed by shifting your diet. Now, what is that going to entail? Because think about how we eat today in the supply chains, the way that's working. Now, a massive shift in that. And then land use change, that big green section there, is what we're going to get into as the program continues. You've seen these maps where there's no human habitation zones included in them. Well, we're going to look at something similar when the eminent domain laws are used by private companies to remove farmers from their land. What happens if the train wrecks? This is another very common one. There's been a huge amount of train derailments with toxic chemicals on it. And they want to have these lands deemed non-livable. And then they want to remove the farmers from the land. They want to have the entire property deemed as an unlivable space. So anytime there's train wrecks now, which seem to be the common, they'll take that land and say, it's an unlivable space. You can't get any insurance. And this is another way. So this land usage change fits right into that. So I'm seeing 2 of these working in tandem here. And again, we keep getting stuck at the 2030 goals. And I think that's really where they want your mind, is the 2030 agenda. They really don't want you to look out at net zero at 2050 targets, because the easiest way to explain it is every single molecule of CO2 produced in a factory or some sort of industrial process, 100% of it will need to be captured and then liquefied and then pushed underground. There will be zero release of any CO2 from any industry, any product, any shipping, any transportation. It all have to be captured and then pushed underground. Now, again, I look at this and I say, well, wait a second. There was a bevy of articles that was out talking about groundwater that was pulled up for agriculture has tilted the Earth's spin, and we affected the Earth's spin by pulling too much groundwater out of a primary ocean under our crust somehow. So what do you think the ramifications from pushing hundreds of millions, if not billions and billions of tons of liquefied CO2 back into the crust is going to do? I mean, you talk out of one side of the mouth, but then another thing, okay, it's bad you're taking water out. Well, what's going to happen when you jam all that back in of not even the same substance? Because taking groundwater out, okay, aquifers do that naturally. They drain out of a crust. But pushing a substance back in there that's not in our crust at that levels and densities, that's going to create its own set of problems. And the long-term ramifications of zero emissions, and I mean zero, bring us to the private sector here. So the Navigator 2 or the Navigator CO2 pipeline, there's two companies that are putting out these massive, I mean massive, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of compressed liquefied CO2 delivery to these carbon capture underground storage facilities. So this is the pipeline here, 1,300 miles, and this one's called the Heartland Greenway. And they are running into an enormous amount of pushback. And if they were going to come through my farm, I'd be the same. I don't want you coming through. You're not a public utility. I understand if it's a city and says, you know, we need to run some power lines to the next part of the, you know, they're developing a neighborhood, or we got right away, we can come through here with a power line. Or, hey, we need to extend the water pipe from your house going back into a forest or going to a different section. So the right of way for a utility is allowed by law, but this different set of CO2 pipelines is private enterprise. But with the hundreds of billions of dollars at stake with the new CO2 underground storage credits, which eclipse greatly just the carbon credit you would get for planting a forest somewhere. So we'll come back to this and really dig down into how South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Nebraska are, you know, getting bent over a barrel here. And it all seems to be lawful how they're stealing farmers' land for private companies. And we saw something like this happen in the Northeast. I think it was Vermont, where Walmart wanted to go in and say, we need that land there, all those farms, because if we build all these facilities, it's going to be much better benefit for the community. And again, you know, you knew that was the first one. That was the first shoe to drop, and you knew it would not stop there. So here's the next prime example of running pipelines all over to get, and those carbon credit, all that money goes back into the private company. None of it comes back to the farmers for their easement that they would have to give up for these pipes to go through their properties. It's a strange world we live in. So when you will own nothing, this is exactly what they're talking about, how they're going to get you off the land so you do own nothing. Eminent domain and private corporations will tell you where you can live and what you can consume. We'll be right back after the break.